Hello, everybody, and we're fortunate now to be joined by a very special guest, the former head coach of the Rockford IceHogs, the one who led the team to their Colonial Cup Championship, Steve Martinson. Coach, really appreciate you taking the time to jump on with us here today.
My pleasure.
So I've got plenty of stuff to talk to you about. Of course, this being the 10-year anniversary of the Rockford IceHogs winning the Colonial Cup, and pretty nice way to put an exclamation mark on the team ending their tenure in the United Hockey League and moving up into the American Hockey League. But I know the start of that season didn't really begin probably the way that you were hoping. The team was hovering around 500, getting up close to the Christmas break, and then suddenly everything sort of changed coming back from Christmas, and you end up going 36-10-5 down the stretch, and eventually, of course, taking the championship. Do you recall what it was that was different with the team down the sort of the final half of that season?
Well, my guess the biggest factor is we had the youngest team in the league, and the advantage of it's people that have kids that play sports, they all get better. Some kids get better at a faster rate, but the advantage of having a young team is they're going to get, theoretically they're going to get better. They're going to improve more than an older team. Usually they're, I know we beat Fort Wayne in the first round, and they had a lot older team, and our team just got better and better, and we loaned players that year, and some of it, I remember we had a stretch where we loaned Nathan Lutz to Milwaukee, and I think there was a stretch where we had 3 defensemen for 3 weeks. And we moved some guys back from forward. So, we loaned players back then, but most of the league wasn't, I think we loaned probably more than most of the league combined.
Well, it certainly, I think, gave those guys some solid experience. And you even mentioned Nathan Lutz, and he was sort of that guy that could be that steady hand for you. And you mentioned he goes up to the American Hockey League. Maybe that gives him a little bit more experience too. But what was the importance maybe of having a player like Nathan Lutz on your back end, a guy who had some experience level and certainly a real good playmaker as well?
Well, the advantage is obviously, he was a guy that played in all situations, 4-on-4, penalty kill, power play, could play a lot. He was, he's just a beast naturally, just, big, solid, hard guy to play against. But, that's what I'm saying. A lot of teams, their go-to defenseman, they're not loaning him in that league. And I think sometimes when you loan players and then you get everybody back at the end of the year, they know that you've tried to help their career, and they're just more vested in winning and pulling together because the organization has tried to help them. And then, we had got everybody back. I think Ulansky was the last guy we got back from Milwaukee, and then we had a pretty solid lineup and by the end of the year.
And he was certainly one of the younger guys, not a rookie that season, but only in his second year pro, I believe, at the time that the team went on to win the Colonial Cup. And he really exploded. You talk about players getting better in the playoffs, and he had a great regular season, but then his playoff numbers as well. He ends up with 21 points in only 17 playoff games. What did you see maybe out of him, especially in the later stages of that season, then going into the playoffs?
Well, he'd been traded from his East Coast League team, and that's when I stepped in and grabbed him. But that's my example of a guy that went up. He went up to Milwaukee, and I had to ask Milwaukee to give him a shot in practice and give him an opportunity. And then they really liked him, and he went up and stayed until they got their players back for the playoffs. But that's that thing. They play at a higher level, and they come down and they feel confident about their game. And Ulansky was just a really, really solid all-around player. He went on to become the MVP, I think, in the Central League playoffs then a few years later for Colorado.
Yeah, and he played almost half the season in Milwaukee that next year, obviously the first year that the IceHogs were in the American Hockey League as well. So that high skill level definitely on display, helping the team capture the championship. And I wanted to ask you about a couple of other guys as well that had a little bit of history coming into the season. We had a chance to talk to Jason Ralph earlier on in this series of notes about the championship run as well. And I know Mike Peck had a chance to talk to him, and he mentioned specifically playing for you was a big reason why he came to Rockford to begin with. Did you go out and target him? Did you remember him from his time with Bakersfield?
Yeah. I remembered him from when I was in San Diego, and he was just a real competitive guy. and you noticed him all the time, and he kind of had that. We want guys that are in shape and work hard, team guys, finish their checks, and I always used to say that. Well, I still say it. I'd rather have a guy with a little less skill that was harder to play against, and that the same mode with Noterman was like that. Ulansky was like that. They were just kind of greasy, in-your-face players. They just competed really hard.
And it's funny that you bring up Noterman, because he was actually the next person on my list that I wanted to ask you about, because he is sort of the embodiment, I think, of a lot of Steve Martinson's style of teams. You talk about him being hard to play against. Not necessarily a big guy, but he still finished the year with 15 goals and over 100 minutes in penalties. He ends up scoring the game-winning goal in Game 7. Why is it so important to have those type of players on your roster?
Well, the playoffs are usually a grind, and you play the same teams over and over and over. And if you have guys that buy into competing and like that, that battle philosophy, that's why you'll see some guys just, they elevate their game in the playoffs. And it's because usually they're just, naturally greasier guys that like that type of competition, because theoretically everybody plays a little harder in the playoffs because obviously everything's on the line. So the guys that, that are typically that type of player during the season, they even elevated a little bit more. So yeah, he was kind of the embodiment. We had a lot of guys that were, that finished their checks, and Noterman wasn't a big guy, but you knew every night if you played against him, he just really hard on pucks, and that goal was like a third or fourth, maybe in a fifth effort. He just kept whacking at the puck in the crease until he knocked it in.
And you see that, I think, and you mentioned it, especially in the playoffs, where those are generally the type of goals that get scored, whether it's in overtime or late in regulation, and proved to be the game-winning tallies. So, certainly fitting that that's the way it worked out for the IceHogs as well. And then one more player that I wanted to get your read on as well before we move further into a little bit more of your impact specifically on the roster, but Chaz Johnson as well, another guy that was here in Rockford that scored a bunch of goals, was real good in the playoffs. What did he bring to your team?
Yeah, he was just, we had some really physical players, and Johnson was, at the top of the food chain. As we used to call him, the missile. I mean, we had Watson, who was a big brute too, but Chaz was really fast, and he could track down and hit the other team's best defenseman. And, a lot of teams in that era had the physical guys that were really good fighters, but they weren't necessarily hard to play against. And we had guys that were tough, but they could skate and hit, because ultimately, fighting only intimidates guys that fight. The guys that can hit hard and hit the other team's good players have a much bigger impact on the outcome of the game.
And we got to see your tenure with the Rockford IceHogs begin in 2004-05, the first year of what eventually turned out to be 3 years, culminating, of course, in that Colonial Cup. But immediately, the impact was felt. The first 2 years you were in Rockford, you get the team to the semifinals in 04-05 and 05-06. And it was really sort of a rebuilding process for you of coming in to Rockford and starting to bring your style of hockey here to the IceHogs. What was maybe some of the biggest challenges that you faced early on, and how did you find so much success right off the bat?
Well, the biggest thing is we had to bring in a lot of new players. There wasn't too many players coming back. I think maybe Nathan Lutz might have been one of the only guys coming back. But I remember when we got J.C. Ruitt and Dufour, and then I could use those names to recruit other players. And once they saw we were signing good players, because what I used to do is I'd go after the ECHL guys that were on the protected list that the other teams weren't offering a raise, and I just go in and give them a pay raise, because back then still now, obviously now they don't have the ECHL, we don't have anybody to compete with, but we got a lot of young players, because I showed in San Diego when we were in the West Coast League, we still loaned a lot of players, and that's what the young guys were looking for. They felt like they were being held back by their teams, and that was the biggest thing, was opportunities. J.C. Ruitt and Dufour, those guys both went to Milwaukee's camp, and that opportunity to move up to the American League is really what we sold, because when you compare our roster to the typical United League roster at the time, we were always one of the youngest teams in the league. I know when we won it, we were probably the youngest team that ever won a championship in that league. So that was my biggest thing is, you know, we were going to help players move up and because of the Wolves and, you know, obviously now Rockford, but we had a lot of AHL teams nearby so they could grab players quick and they could drive up to the game, and it just provided a lot of opportunity. And that's really what the young guys are looking for is they want to play in a system that, you know, that will showcase. And we played an offensive system. I thought we played a physical system. I've always said I've had the same team for 20 years, just different names, but, you know, we played the same style and, you know, players points and get points and goals, get them noticed. And then their ability to play without the puck is what you kind of have to make sure they learn. And that's what keeps them in the American League.
And it was the first time that the IceHogs had captured a league championship, but it wasn't the first time that you had done so. You had managed to make it happen a few times, I know, with San Diego. How much were you able to draw on that previous experience with the Gulls and then find a way to translate that into getting a championship here in Rockford?
Well, ultimately, it was the ability to recruit players. And you know, that's what I had the advantage of some of the other coaches. And, you know, is that I had a track record of winning and guys having their best offensive numbers. And I still use that now, winning, you know, better offensive numbers playing in our system. And then, you know, opportunity to loan players. I've never held a player back. Like I said, I mean, back then, nobody would have loaned their top defenseman, leaving him with 3 defensemen for as long as we did. But, you know, that pays off in players knowing, like I said, knowing that, you know, the organization cares about their career, and then they're willing to, you know, to pay a steeper price in the playoffs. And that's what, you know, that's what got us past Fort Wayne. They had a big experienced team, but they didn't like having to play against our guys, didn't give them any respect to being older. And it was, you know, one hit after another, and they didn't want to pay the price.
And you got a chance to beat up on not just one rival for the IceHogs in Fort Wayne, but also arguably the biggest UHL rival in Quad City on the path to the championship. And eventually you make it there. You're battling it out against Kalamazoo. And the way that series turned out, the home team ended up winning every single game in that series. What was it about home ice, do you think, in that final series that made it so important as the IceHogs eventually did get that win?
Well, theoretically, the biggest thing about home ice is to get last change. It's easier to get in your matchup, so that's one advantage. But you know, our crowd was packed, and when that rink is packed, I mean, the crowd was loud, and obviously that gives you a little bit more energy. Game 7s, you typically don't need the extra energy, but you know, I think it's a combination of earning that home ice all season long, and it kicks off. And yeah, I've had a few best of 7s that home ice kicks in, and it's a huge advantage.
And just to get that boost, I think, too, after you go through this long playoff run and everybody's sort of worn out at the end, and you're driving back and forth from Rockford to Kalamazoo, which it's not exactly the longest trip ever, but it's not a short one either. I mean, that had to be taking a toll.
Yeah, the travel always adds up. And, you know, being able to be in your own bed and having your own, you know, your typical, you know, what your daily routines, all that stuff adds up. But I think, you know, one of the biggest things is the, you know, the electricity you get from a big crowd. And I remember that night was, you know, the rink was hopping.
And it certainly is an experience that our fans remember. It's still many times has been mentioned to us as one of the most memorable things for those longtime IceHog fans was seeing the team win the Colonial Cup. So very cool that happened, and you were certainly a huge part of making that come over here to Rockford, and sort of a cool send-off for the team as well before they moved up to the American Hockey League. Now, to sort of look at this past season also, you still have a tie certainly to the Rockford IceHogs. We saw goaltender Jake Hildebrand here this year. He spent a little bit of time with you last year while the Allen Americans were making their way to another ECHL championship. And then right now, Tyler Barnes is down there. Can you tell us a little bit about how Barnes has been doing for you?
Well, he's one of those guys you really notice at our level, and he competes hard. And, you know, he's been one of the top players in the coast. And, you know, I approached Mark Bernard about, you know, helping me out and see if we could get him for the playoffs. So, you know, it all worked out. I mean, part of it, you know, we did a favor with them for Hildebrand, and hockey's a small world, so the favorite came back. And I think, maybe that the fact that I coached in Rockford helped a little bit. And, I still come back there in the summertime. So, I'm always following how Rockford does. And Barnes is a great kid, and hopefully he helps us win another championship.
It'll be fun to see you achieve that once again with the Allen Americans. Before we let you run, one last question for you, though. When you look back at that Game 7, and it was such a tight hockey game, Rockford ends up with the win. You take the Colonial Cup. What was your favorite part of either the Game 7 as a whole, or simply being able to realize that and eventually take that championship? What was your favorite part about that process there?
Well, knowing that, the team was leaving and it was the last year and it was the last opportunity to be able to win, then it was, we had pretty good teams over the 3 years. And what I always look at it, it's not easy to win it, but do you have a team that's good enough to win it? Because there's other factors that, you can get injuries. The year before we had a pretty good team, but by the time we lost to Fort Wayne in the semis, we were down to like 13 players, and the rules didn't allow you to carry that many players back then. So, to me, it was a culmination. We won it the right way. We had, a good young team and a bunch of guys that were trying to further their careers. And, we had a fan base that was, solid, and it all worked out great.
Well, Steve, we certainly do appreciate you taking the time to join us here, and we'll look forward to keeping an eye on how things are going for you in Allen as well.
All right, thanks, Bob.
That is the former head coach of the IceHogs, the one who was manning the helm when the team took their Colonial Cup victory in 2006-07. Steve Martinson. Of course, stay tuned to IceHogs.com.